Hello, welcome to this MOOC course on Environmental Humanities. We are discussing things in week 2 and now this is lecture number 9 or the lecture number 4 of second week. So today in the previous discussions we have examined climate change as a problem of narrative form. We discussed why climate change creates representational difficulty, why linear narratives often fail to contain it, why writers turn to fragmentation. Now, today we continue that discussion by focusing on another crucial element of narrative form, that is language. So, if the previous lectures asked us how climate change can be structured as a story, today's discussion will focus on something else, and that is what kind of language can speak climate catastrophe. This is a deeply important question. Climate change is not difficult to plot. It is also difficult to name, describe, and communicate. The words available to us often seem either too weak or too excessive. If we use bureaucratic language, the crisis may sound manageable, ordinary, or technical. If we use apocalyptic language, the crisis may seem so overwhelming that people will feel helpless. Climate writing must therefore negotiate a very difficult linguistic space. It must speak truthfully without numbing the reader. It must create urgency without producing despair. It must remain scientifically responsible while also conveying emotional, ethical, and imaginative force. So here today, in this lecture, we will examine how language comes under pressure in climate writing. We will discuss the failures of understatement and hyperbole, the need for what we may call a third register, the role of metaphor and the specific linguistic strategies used by Rachel Carson, Margaret Atwood, and Kim Stanley Robinson. We will also ask how silence itself can function as a form of environmental language. So let's move on. Let us begin with the idea that language is not a neutral medium. We often assume that words simply describe reality. But as we have discussed throughout this course, representation is never passive. The words we use shape how we understand the world, how we feel about it, and how we respond to it. This is especially true in relation to environmental crisis. When we describe a river as a resource, we frame it differently from when we describe it as a living ecosystem, a sacred river, or a community of life. Similarly, when we describe climate change as a warming, crisis, emergency, or catastrophe, each word produces a different emotional and political effect. Climate change places language under intense pressure because the crisis exceeds many of our ordinary terms. Words such as summer, flood, drought, storm, and home once referred to experiences that seemed familiar within historical memory. But under climate change, these words are being stretched. A summer may now mean deadly heat. A flood may now mean repeated displacement. A home may become uninhabitable. A drought may no longer be an unusual event, but part of a transformed climate pattern. The words remain familiar, but the realities they describe have changed. This is not merely a semantic problem, it is a political and ethical problem. If language makes catastrophe sound ordinary, people may fail to respond. If language makes catastrophe sound unavoidable, people may also fail to respond. In both cases, the wrong language can weaken ethical and political action. Climate writing therefore becomes an attempt to find, reshape, or forge a language adequate to what is happening. The writer must ask, how do we describe a crisis that is at once scientific, emotional, political, historical, and planetary? How do we speak of loss without turning it into spectacle? How do we create urgency without destroying hope? These questions guide our discussion right now. So climate discourse often falls into two opposite linguistic failures: understatement and hyperbole. Let us begin with the understatement. Understatement occurs when language makes catastrophe sound manageable, technical, or ordinary. This often happens in bureaucratic, institutional, and technocratic discourse. Words such as mitigation, adaptation, externalities, risk management, and even warming can be useful in policy contexts, but they may also soften the emotional reality of the crisis. For example, the word warming may sound mild, even pleasant. It does not immediately communicate heat, death, crop failure, drought, sea level rise, extreme storms, or ecological breakdown. Similarly, externalities can make suffering sound like an accounting category rather than a lived reality. This kind of language may be produced by institutions that need to discuss crisis without producing panic. But the danger is that it normalizes what should not be normal. The second failure is hyperbole. Hyperbolic climatic language speaks in terms of total apocalypse, inevitable extinction, final collapse, or unavoidable doom. This language may appear powerful because it captures urgency, but it carries another danger: paralysis. If catastrophe is described as total and inevitable, then action can seem pointless. People may disengage because they feel that nothing that they do can matter. So understatement anesthetizes, hyperbole paralyzes. Both failures prevent adequate response, though in different ways. The challenge for climate writing is to avoid both. It must not make catastrophe sound harmless, but it must also not make the future sound completely closed. Now, moving on, if understatement and hyperbole are both inadequate, then effective climate writing must search for what we may call a third register. Thus, this third register lies between bureaucratic numbness and apocalyptic excess. It is precisely without being anesthetic, it is urgent without being paralyzing, it is emotionally powerful without abandoning factual responsibility. It allows readers to feel the seriousness of the crisis, without concluding that nothing can be done. So this is an extremely difficult balance. Lawrence Buell's idea of dual accountability, which we discussed earlier, is useful here. Buell argues that environmental writing must remain accountable both to material reality and to cultural meaning. In this slide, you can see the phrase is extended to suggest responsibility both to the human community and to the non-human world. This means that that environmental language cannot speak only in abstract scientific terms. It must also speak to human emotion, ethical obligation, ecological relation, and non-human life. At the same time, it cannot become purely symbolic or sentimental. It must remain grounded in ecological fact. The third register therefore holds together science and feeling. Rachel Carson, Margaret Atwood, and Kim Stanley Robinson each developed their own version of this register. As you already saw in the discussion in previous lectures, Carson combines lyric beauty with scientific precision. Atwood uses irony, estrangement, and naming to expose the assumptions hidden in everyday language. Robinson combines the technical language of systems with the intimate language of testimony and bodily experience. Each writer recognizes that climate catastrophe requires more than information. It requires language that can make information meaningful. As we have seen throughout this course, that humanities do not replace science, they translate knowledge into perception, responsibility, and imagination, and that's what we are looking at. Now we turn to metaphor. In ordinary usage, metaphor is often treated as decorative language. In my opening discussions, I touched upon the aspect of metaphor briefly. Here, what I want to say, in climate writing, metaphor is not merely decoration, it is a cognitive and political tool. George Lakoff and Mark Johnson's influential book, Metaphors We Live By, published in 1980, argues that metaphors structure how we think, not merely how we speak. In other words, metaphors are not ornaments added to thought, they shape thought itself. This insight is extremely important for climate discourse. Consider some common metaphors. When we say the planet has a fever, we frame climate change as illness. This metaphor makes the crisis understandable through the familiar mode of a sick body. It also implies that treatment or cure may be possible. However, it may conceal the political and economic systems that cause the illness. When we speak of a war on climate change, we frame the crisis as an enemy to be defeated. This can create urgency and mobilization, but it may also oversimplify agency. Climate change is not an external enemy standing outside us. It is produced through systems in which many human societies participate, though unequally. When we speak of a tipping point, we emphasize thresholds after which change may become irreversible. This metaphor is useful because it communicates danger and urgency, but it can also encourage fatalism if readers believe the threshold has already been crossed. Every metaphor illuminates some aspects of reality and conceals others. This means that climate metaphors must be used carefully. They can shape public imagination, policy response, ethical responsibility, and emotional engagement. In environmental humanities, we therefore ask not only whether a metaphor is beautiful or memorable, we ask, what does this metaphor make visible? What does it hide? What kind of action does it encourage? What kind of responsibility does it assign? Metaphor is therefore a major site of climate politics. Again, referring back to Carson, to discuss the language, Silent Spring offers one of the powerful examples of environmental language in the 20th century. Carson's central linguistic strategy is to use the language of beauty, abundance, and pastoral harmony in order to describe its destruction. This is already visible in the title Silent Spring. Spring traditionally suggests renewal, bird song, fertility, flowers, seasonal return, and natural vitality. But Carson places the word silent before it. The result is deeply unsettling. A season associated with sound and life becomes marked by absence. The spring is silent because it was once full of sound. The loss is felt through the gap between what should be there and what is no longer there. Carson draws upon the long tradition of pastoral writing in English literature. The pastoral tradition often represents rural or natural landscapes as spaces of harmony, abundance, simplicity, and seasonal rhythm. But Carson does not simply reproduce pastoral beauty, she interrupts it. She shows that seasonal return itself has been broken. Birds do not return. The landscape does not renew itself. The ordinary cycle of life is disturbed by chemical contamination. This creates what we may call linguistic mourning. The beauty of Carson's language does not escape from ecological damage. It intensifies the reader's sense of what is being lost. The lyricism becomes a form of grief. This was a deliberate rhetoric choice. Carson understood that scientific data alone might not move the public. She therefore wrote in a language that combined observation, feeling, and warning. Her prose allowed readers not only to know environmental damage, but also to feel it. And then, alongside its lyricism, Silent Spring is also a work of remarkable precision. Carson does not speak only in journal terms. She names specific chemicals, species, locations, and documented cases. This precision is central to her authority as a writer. The damage she describes is not vague. It is not merely an abstract threat to nature. It is happening to particular birds, particular insects, particular fields, particular orchards, particular communities, and particular ecosystems. This is rhetorically very important. General language can be dismissed. Specific language is harder to evade. When Carson names a chemical, identifies a species, or describes a documented ecological effect, she grounds her argument in material reality. At the same time, her lyrical prose ensures that these facts do not remain emotionally distant. This combination of registers is one of the great strengths of silent whispering. Carson joins scientific precision with literary feeling. Neither element alone would have had the same effect. If the book had been only lyrical, critics would have dismissed it as sentimental. If it had been only technical, it might not have reached or moved a broad readership. The chemical industry did attack Carson's science after the publication of Silent Spring, but the book's combination of fact, feeling, detail, and moral urgency made it extremely difficult to dismiss in public discourse. So this tells us an important thing about climate language. Effective environmental writing often depends on the combination of registers. It must be accurate enough to be credible and powerful enough to be felt. This is precisely the third register we discussed earlier. Now, Margaret Atwood's language works differently from Carson's. Where Carson often combines lyrical beauty and scientific precision, Atwood frequently uses irony and linguistic estrangement. Irony occurs when language means more than it appears to say, or when it says one thing while revealing another. Atwood uses irony to expose the hidden assumptions of consumer culture, technological optimism, patriarchy, corporate power, and ecological indifference. The concept of defamiliarization associated with Russian formalist critic Viktor Shklovsky is useful here. Defamiliarization refers to the artistic technique of making familiar things appear strange so that we can perceive them anew. Atwood uses this technique repeatedly. In her speculative fiction, words and habits from the present are placed in future context where their consequences have become catastrophic. Corporate slogans, brand names, bureaucratic phrases, and ordinary consumer language begin to look disturbing because the reader sees what they have helped produce. This is especially important because many destructive systems survive by appearing normal. Consumer culture often presents itself through cheerful language, convenience, choice, lifestyle, innovation, progress. Atwood's irony makes such language strange. She shows that language of the present may already contain signs of future catastrophe. This is a form of linguistic intervention. Atwood does not simply invent strange futures. She uses the language of our own world to show us what we are failing to notice. Her fiction asks, what do our words reveal about us? What assumptions are hidden in our slogans? What futures are already contained in the language of the present? In this way, irony becomes an ecological tool of critique. Atwood's essays also return repeatedly to the power of naming. To name something is not a neutral act. Naming makes something visible. It gives it a category. It makes it available for thought, discussion, critique, and action. If something cannot be named, it often remains difficult to recognize. If a crisis is named wrongly, it may be misunderstood. If it is named accurately, it can become politically and ethically visible. In other words, SF and the Human Imagination by Atwood, she reflects on how science fiction has often named possible futures before they arrived. This is one of the important functions of speculative writing. It gives language to emerging conditions before ordinary discourse fully catches up with them. Atwood's own term, utopia, is an example of naming as a conceptual creation. By combining these two terms, she creates a word that captures the fact that imagined good and bad future are often intertwined. A dystopian world may contain possibilities of resistance. A utopian project may contain hidden violence or exclusion. The word gives us a new way of thinking. This is why naming matters in climate writing. If ecological catastrophe is described only as development, growth, progress, or modernization, its violence may remain hidden. If environmental damage is named as injustice, extinction, toxicity, dispossession, or slow violence, different forms of thought and action become possible. Atwood treats language as a site of political struggle. Words do not merely communicate ideas that already exist. They help create the conditions that under which ideas can be recognized. And for our discussion, for our field, this is a central insight. Changing ecological imagination often requires changing ecological language. Now, in Kim Stanley Robinson's The Ministry for the Future, a different linguistic challenge is introduced, which is how to make the language of systems emotionally and politically legible. Much of Robinson's novel concerns subjects that do not traditionally seem literary. Central banking, carbon markets, financial instruments, international institutions, policy mechanisms, and economic modeling. Now, these subjects are difficult to narrate because their language is technical, abstract, and often affectless. Words from economics and policy can feel distant from ordinary human experience. They may describe real suffering, but in a language that seems cold. Robinson's challenge is therefore linguistic as much as narrative. How can a novel make carbon accounting matter emotionally? How can it make readers care about central banking? How can it show that financial systems are not separate from ecological survival? His strategy is to alternate between technical language and personal testimony. Some chapters discuss systems, institutions, policy, and economic mechanisms. Other chapters return to intensely personal experiences of trauma, survival, fear, and vulnerability. The effect is a form of linguistic counterpoint. The cold language of systems is repeatedly interrupted by the warm language of individual experience. The reader is asked to understand that neither register is sufficient alone. Personal testimony without systems analysis may show sufferings but not explain its structural causes. System analysis without testimony may explain mechanisms but fail to convey human cost. Robinson insists that climate change requires both languages. This is a very important lesson for environmental humanities. Ecological crisis must be understood through emotion and structure, body and system, experience and policy. Robinson's linguistic experimentation goes even further when the Ministry for the Future gives narrative voice to non-human entities. Some chapters adopt perspectives associated with entities such as carbon atom or a photon. Now, this is a radical literary experiment because these entities do not use human language. The question becomes, how can a novelist write from a non-human perspective without simply turning the non-human into a disguised human voice? This is one of the central challenges of more than human narrative. As we discussed earlier, environmental humanities asks us to move beyond anthropocentrism or the assumption that human experience is the only meaningful center of the world. Giving voice to non-human entities is one way of challenging that assumption, but it also raises a problem. Can human language ever adequately represent a non-human experience? Or does it inevitably anthropomorphize, meaning that it gives human qualities to non-human beings and processes? Robinson does not fully solve this problem. Instead, he dramatizes it. By attempting to write from non-human perspectives, he reminds us that climate change is not merely a human story. Carbon, sunlight, atmosphere, ocean, animals, forests, and technologies all participate in the climate system. These chapters also disturb the reader's sense of scale. A carbon atom belongs to a chemical and geological processes that exceed the scale of human life. A photon belongs to physical processes that challenge ordinary narrative imagination. Robinson's linguistic experiment, therefore, does not simply add variety to the novel, it forces the reader to confront the limits of human-centered language. Climate catastrophe requires us to ask not only how humans speak about nature, but how literature might gesture toward worlds that exceed human speech. So we now pause over one word, catastrophe. The word catastrophe comes from the Greek catastrophe, meaning an overturning or sudden turn. In classical dramatic theory, the catastrophe refers to the final resolution or disastrous conclusion of a tragedy. This dramatic inheritance matters when we use the word catastrophe in climate discourse. It often suggests something sudden, decisive, and irreversible. It suggests a dramatic event, a collapse, a final turning, a point, a moment after which everything changes. But climate change does not always operate in this way. Of course, climate change can intensify sudden disasters such as floods, storms, wildfires, heat waves, but much climate harm is also gradual, cumulative, uneven, and dispersed. This is why the word catastrophe can be linguistically misleading. If we expect catastrophe to arrive only as a single dramatic event, we may fail to notice forms of harm that accumulate slowly. Rising temperatures, groundwater depletion, biodiversity loss, toxic exposure, soil degradation, and slow displacement may not look like catastrophe in the classical dramatic sense, but they are catastrophic in their consequences. Rob Nixon's concept of slow violence, which we discussed earlier in several occasions, is partly a critique of this dramatic model of harm. Slow violence names environmental damage that is delayed, dispersed, and often invisible. Climate writing must therefore find ways to represent harm that does not arrive as a traditional catastrophe. This requires a transformation of language. We need words and forms that can express gradual destruction without making it seem less urgent. We need to learn how to recognize slow catastrophe, distributed catastrophe, and uneven catastrophe. The word catastrophe is powerful, but climate writing must use it carefully. One of the most striking linguistic strategies in environmental and climate writing is the use of silence. Silence may seem like the absence of language, but in literature, silence can carry meaning. What is not said, what cannot be said, what has disappeared, and what no longer speaks can become deeply significant. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring makes silence itself the central sign of ecological damage. The silence in Carson is not peaceful. It is not the silence of rest, contemplation, or calm. It is the silence of absence. Birds are silent because they are gone. Spring is silent because life has been interrupted. The missing sound becomes evidence of ecological loss. This is a powerful reversal. Usually we listen for presence. Carson teaches us to listen for absence. Atwood uses silence differently. In her speculative fiction, silence often marks political repression, fear, censorship, and the inability to speak openly under oppressive systems. Silence becomes a sign of power operating through control. In both Carson and Atwood, silence is not empty, it is charged with meaning. Robinson uses silence structurally. The short chapters of the Ministry for the Future often create gaps between perspectives, events, and the registers. These gaps force the readers to pause, absorb, and reorient. Silence then becomes part of form. In climate writing, silence can signify extinction, repression, trauma, and grief, incomprehension, or the limits of language itself. This is especially important because ecological loss often appears first as absence. Fewer birds, fewer insects, fewer trees, fewer seasons as we remember them, fewer familiar patterns. To read environmental literature carefully, we must therefore learn not only to interpret what is spoken, but also to notice what has fallen silent. We now turn to a close reading exercise from the opening chapter of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. The passage reads like this. There was once a town in the heart of America where all life seemed to live in harmony with its surroundings. Then a strange blight crept over the area and everything began to change. Unquote. Let us begin with the first sentence. There was once a town immediately invokes the language of fable, fairy tale, and pastoral storytelling. It suggests distance, memory, and perhaps innocence. The phrase places the reader in a familiar narrative world. The phrase in the heart of America is also important. It suggests centrality. Carson is not describing a remote or exceptional place. She is placing the crisis at the symbolic center of ordinary national life. The phrase, all life seemed to live in harmony with its surroundings, draws upon pastoral language. It invokes balance, community, and ecological relation. But we should notice the word seemed. Even before the damage is named, this word introduces uncertainty. Harmony may be real, but it may also be fragile. Now let us consider the word blight. Blight has several connotations. Agriculturally, it suggests plant disease, crop damage, and ecological harm. Biblically or morally, it can suggest curse, corruption, or punishment. In literary terms, it often evokes decay, contamination, and the loss of vitality. The phrase, a strange blight crept over the area, is very powerful because the verb crept suggests slow, almost invisible movement. The damage does not arrive dramatically, it spreads quietly. Finally, the phrase everything began to change is both vague and ominous. It does not specify what changes. This vagueness creates suspense. At the same time, the word everything suggests total transformation. Carson manages the tension between precision and uncertainty. She withholds details in order to create unease and then later supplies scientific specificity. So if we compare this passage with a technical passage from Robinson's The Ministry for the Future, we see two very different registers. Carson uses fable, pastoral imagery, and the ominous transformation. Robinson uses policy, economics, and the systems language. Carson makes ecological loss emotionally perceptible. Robinson makes structural complexity visible. Now, each register makes something possible. Each also conceals something. That is why climate writing often needs multiple languages. So these are the works that I have discussed here, used here. I hope you have enjoyed listening to and talking about the language of climate writing, which is a very, very important component of environmental humanities. Thank you very much. I meet you in the different lecture.